I'm very excited to introduce our next guest as well. He's a good friend to a lot of folks up here in New Hampshire, and I know that you all see his face on TV on a regular basis. He's the executive editor of the Weekly Standard, a frequent contributor to Fox News. He's been a White House correspondent for the New Republican. Spent 10 years doing that job. And if I recall correctly, I think the first time he started covering politics was during Ronald Reagan's 1976 primary against Gerald Ford. Nashua has a great history in the First Nation primary. I don't know if you realize it was in Nashua that Ronald Reagan had his great "I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green" moment right at our high school. We're so excited to welcome Mr. Fred Barnes.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I was there at that Nashua event with Ronald Reagan. It was remarkable. I can remember it vividly. As a matter of fact, last year when I was here at this event, I talked about it a little bit from the audience. You never know. You probably wonder why I'm speaking first. And it all goes, I've known Jennifer Horn now for about 20 years, back when she had the radio show here in Nashua. She used to call me in Washington, and I'd go on her show. It was a lot of fun. We've been friends ever since then, and she made me this offer. She said, "Fred, you can speak one of two places. You can speak in the afternoon after Chris Christie and just before Jeb Bush, or you can speak now." And here I am. Jennifer, if you're still looking for somebody for that afternoon spot, I recommend my colleague at the Weekly Standard, Steve Hayes. Don't tell him I said that. I'm going to be pretty short. You know, John F. Kennedy is sort of my idea of a guy who knew how to give a stump speech, or a speech of the right length, and his were always 10 to 12 minutes. I just finished a book about Jack Kemp with my friend Mort Kondracki. Jack Kemp's stump speech was 3 or 4 times that length. And he'd make the same points over and over again. I mean, repetition does work in politics. I'm really just going to talk about 2 things this morning, very quickly. Try to answer 2 questions. One is, why has this presidential campaign started so early? And 2, why is it the most important, at least in my mind, since 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president? Let me start with why there's a much bigger crowd here today than there was a year ago when I was here, because this campaign started so early and so interesting. I have no complaint about that, obviously. And the reason is very, very, very simple. It is sort of a field of dreams phenomenon. And instead of building a baseball field, the press, immediately after the midterm election in November, the press started covering presidential candidates. People not who'd announced, but people who were talking about being presidential candidates. Started back then. And if the press is there, the candidates will come. And they have. And on top of that, the most remarkable thing about it is the intensity of the press coverage. It's been incredibly intense. I mean, there's stories that the Weekly Standard will have 2 or 3 or 4 stories about Republican presidential candidates in every issue. Steve Hayes, who I'm sure you'll hear from later, maybe not in that spot I mentioned, has a story in the Weekly Standard this week about the rise of Marco Rubio. And on it goes. Steve has done some really terrific stories. And look at the things that have happened. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, has practically been entirely vetted already by the press. I mean, there have even been stories about why he dropped out of college in his senior year. And if you read these stories, they were looking for something that they didn't quite find. You can imagine what it might be. And Marco Rubio, there's a story out. I mean, these are stories that come late in a campaign when they're, particularly with Republican candidates, that the reporters are looking for something just to complete the vetting of a candidate. And Marco Rubio, there have already been stories out about the so-called House of Horrors, about a house that he and another, a friend of his who was a congressman from Florida bought in Tallahassee, and a lot of problems with it, and it's for sale again, and so on. You don't want to read it, but you can see how the minutia that the press has already gone to about the candidates. Amazing. And the intensity of it is really extraordinary. It's just never happened this way before. Remember, as a matter of fact, John Kennedy announced for president in January of the election year, January 1960. Bill Clinton announced in '92 in September before the election year in 1992. And now, well, we know what happens. Now, it's completely different. I like it, but it is new. The second question is, why is this election so important? And the reason is, there will be so much on the next president's table, particularly if you're a Republican. If you're a Democrat, you're largely going to just try to be defensive and hold on to President Obama's policies. And, you know, raise Social Security benefits and fool around with the wages and so on, and raise the minimum wage and so on, things that will probably not happen because there'll still be a Republican House, I feel certain, in the Senate. I think has a better chance of still being a Republican Senate, a better chance than not. So why is it so important for a Republican president? Because there's so many things to do that are huge. The first one is, of course, how deftly are you going to undo Obama's policies? I think one of the easier ones is actually Obamacare, because there's been so much written about it, there's been so much thought about it. All the Republican think tanks, conservative think tanks, have looked into it, and there's a good way to change Obamacare, if not repeal it, in a way that will not drive the country crazy. Remember, one of the problems for Obama was he sought no compromise with Republicans, gave them nothing on Obamacare. No Republican voted for it, and as an entitlement, which entitlements are usually bipartisan, almost always bipartisan, this one wasn't, and it's been controversial and unpopular ever since. You don't want to repeat that. There's so many things to do. How do you, it's easy to undo all the executive orders, but you have to do this very carefully. What do you do with the EPA? What do you do with any other agency? There are just so many of them that really need to be handled, and it's hard. It's very difficult to do. Then, as an example, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can be changed depending on who leads the court, one way or another, and who is nominated and will take their seats. There are 4 Supreme Court justices right now who are 76 or older. The oldest is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal. She's 82. Nino Scalia is 79. Justice Kennedy, a Reagan appointee, is 78. And who's the last one? Stephen Breyer from Massachusetts, a Democratic appointee, is 76. There are going to be some changes, and depending on what they are, the court will be more liberal, more conservative. It makes a huge difference. Another issue is rebuilding the military. Our military is really in sad shape. I mean, it's really been cut to the bone, and then some. It's not even, Reagan had a great build-up when he became president, but it took a number of years. It doesn't just happen overnight. You have to start on that. There's reversing the decline of American influence around the world. The world is scared because the U.S. is playing a much smaller role now than it traditionally has. You hear it wherever you go. You hear it in Australia. I happened to be in Australia a year and a half ago, and you hear it there. In Australia, they took it seriously. President Obama said he would tilt toward Asia. They're still asking, where's the tilt? They haven't seen it yet. And on and on. Entitlements. Now, there will be a big fight over entitlements, but we can't just leave them that way, pouring out the money without reforming. And then there's Iran. Now, I think at the Weekly Standard, we are fervent opponents of the deal that's been made, that President Obama has made with Iran. But I think the president's going to prevail. It's very hard. I think he's going to be successful. The Iranians, can't be trusted. They've never not cheated on any deal they've made. And so when you come around, okay, say the deal goes into effect later this year, get around to early 2017, and it's obvious they're cheating, or it's obvious they're interpreting things in the treaty that are preposterous just to let them actually be moving on it and building a nuclear weapon, which they haven't done so far, and helping them do that. The president's going to play a huge role. He's going to want to reinstitute sanctions for sure, harsh sanctions, and the hard part is this, getting the Europeans to go along with it. Germany, Britain, France, the French are actually pretty good. They don't like the deal either, but they're not going to block it unless the U.S. is leading the way, because it's quite the opposite. That's going to be a huge problem for the president. So when you look at all these things, America is a different country than it was 6 years ago. And so much has to be done. When Ronald Reagan became president, remember what he did. He was fortunate that there's this phenomenon that no matter what Congress is like, the new president gets one or two things that are at the top of his agenda. And Reagan had two. One was to revive the American economy, and he did so much with the tax cuts that were inspired by Jack Kemp. He compromised a little bit. The tax cuts was 25% across the board in individual income, not 30 as he proposed, but he got them through, and the economy, like a rocket, 6% in 1980, in 1983 and 1984, just remarkable. And the second thing was to not coexist